Somewhere on a dark highway between Nashville and Memphis, in the small hours of an October morning in 1954, a 19-year-old boy sat in the back seat of a car and wept. His name was Elvis Aaron Presley. He had just performed on the most hallowed stage in American country music, the Grand Ole Opry, broadcast to millions of listeners across the nation from the historic Ryman Auditorium. He had sung his heart out, and when the song ended, a man in a suit had looked him in the eye and told him to go back to driving trucks. The car rolled through the Tennessee darkness. In the front seat, guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black sat in silence, unsure what to say. There was nothing to say. They had all heard it. They had all seen the polite, bewildered faces in the audience. People who had expected bluegrass and received something they could not name, something that made them uncomfortable, something that sounded like the future arriving before anyone was ready for it. At a gas station somewhere in the middle of nowhere, they stopped for fuel. Elvis went to the restroom. When he came back to the car, he was still crying. He did not notice that he had left his suitcase hanging on the back of the bathroom door. It contained everything he owned: his stage clothes, his personal belongings, the few possessions of a young man who had nothing except a voice and a dream that as of tonight seemed to be dying. 3 months earlier, Elvis Presley had been a truck driver for Crown Electric Company in Memphis. He earned $40 a week delivering supplies to construction sites, listening to the radio as he drove, dreaming of a life he had no realistic way to reach. He had walked into the Memphis recording service the summer before, paid $4 to record a song for his mother, and caught the attention of a woman named Marion Kiesker, who worked for the studio's owner, Sam Phillips. She had written down his name and phone number. She had sensed something in his voice that she could not quite define. It took almost a year for that phone call to come. When it did, Sam Phillips invited Elvis back to the studio to audition. The session was scheduled for June 26, 1954. Elvis arrived wearing a black shirt, pink pants with a black stripe, and white shoes, an outfit that made Scotty Moore's wife nearly bolt out the back door when she first saw him. His hair was long and greasy, combed into a ducktail that he kept nervously patting down. He looked like trouble. He sounded like nothing anyone had ever heard. The audition went poorly. Elvis sang every ballad he knew, but nothing clicked. Sam Phillips was patient, probing, trying to find whatever it was that Marion had heard in this strange, nervous kid. Nothing worked. Finally, on July 5th, during a break in yet another frustrating session, Elvis picked up his guitar and started fooling around with an old blues song called "That's All Right." It was a song by Arthur Big Boy Crudup, and Elvis sang it fast and loose, almost as a joke. Bill Black grabbed his bass and started slapping along. Scotty Moore jumped in on guitar. Sam Phillips stuck his head out of the control room and asked, "What are you doing?" Nobody really knew, but Phillips told them to do it again, and this time he was recording. The song that emerged was unlike anything on the radio. It was not quite country. It was not quite blues. It was not quite anything that had a name yet. When Phillips played it for Dewey Phillips, no relation, a popular Memphis disc jockey, Dewey put it on the air that same night. The phone lines at the radio station lit up. Listeners wanted to know who this singer was. Some wanted to know if he was white or black. The music seemed to exist in a space between categories that American society had kept rigidly separate. Elvis was white, but he sang like he had absorbed the soul of the blues and the energy of gospel and the longing of country music, mixing them together in a way that felt dangerous and exciting and new. Within weeks, he was playing small shows across Tennessee and Mississippi. The crowds were modest but enthusiastic. Young people responded to him in ways that older audiences found unsettling. There was something about the way he moved, the way he let the music take over his body, that seemed to bypass the brain entirely and speak directly to something primal. Sam Phillips believed he had found something special. He believed that Elvis Presley could be the bridge between white audiences and black music, a performer who could bring the power and emotion of rhythm and blues to listeners who would never buy a record by a black artist, but might accept the same energy if it came from someone who looked like them. It was a cynical calculation in some ways, but it was also a genuine artistic vision. Phillips wanted to change American music, and he thought this awkward, insecure teenager from Tupelo might be the one to do it. But first they needed exposure. They needed validation from the establishment, and in 1954 there was no greater establishment in country music than the Grand Ole Opry. The Grand Ole Opry had been broadcasting from Nashville since 1925. It was the longest-running radio program in American history, a Saturday night institution that defined what country music was and who was allowed to perform it. To appear on the Opry stage was to receive the blessing of the genre's gatekeepers. It meant you had arrived. It meant you belonged. Sam Phillips worked his connections and secured a spot for Elvis, Scotty, and Bill on the October 2nd broadcast. They would perform during the 10:15 segment, not prime time, but respectable. They would have one song, one chance to make an impression on the most important audience in country music. The three musicians drove to Nashville on Saturday morning. Elvis had spent all week agonizing over what to wear, what to sing, how to carry himself on a stage where legends like Hank Williams and Ernest Tubb and Roy Acuff had stood before him. He settled on his best clothes, which by Opry standards were still too flashy, too youthful, too much. He chose to sing Blue Moon of Kentucky, a Bill Monroe song that he and the band had recorded as the B-side of their first single. It was a bluegrass standard, beloved by Opry audiences. But Elvis's version was different. He had sped it up, added a driving rhythm, transformed it from a gentle waltz into something urgent and propulsive. He hoped it would be enough. He hoped they would understand. The Ryman Auditorium was not what Elvis had expected. He had listened to the Opry on the radio throughout his childhood, imagining a palace of music, a cathedral of sound. The reality was a former church, a wooden building with hard pews and no air conditioning, packed with an audience of farmers and families and music lovers who had come from across the region to witness their Saturday night ritual. The air inside was thick with heat and humidity, and the mingled sense of perfume and sweat. Backstage, Elvis was a wreck. He paced, he fidgeted, he kept running his hands through his hair, trying to get it to stay in place. At one point, he found himself standing near a bass player named Buddy Killen, who worked as a song plugger for a Nashville publishing company. Killen introduced himself, trying to be friendly. Elvis looked at him with haunted eyes. "They're going to hate me," he said. Killen tried to reassure him. "They're not going to hate you. You're going to be fine." Elvis shook his head. "If they'd just let me leave, I'd go right now." But there was no leaving. The time had come. An announcer called their names, and Elvis, Scotty, and Bill walked out onto the stage that had haunted his dreams since childhood. The lights were bright. The audience was a sea of faces. Older faces, mostly, people who had grown up on the music of Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family, people who knew exactly what country music was supposed to sound like. And then Elvis Presley began to sing. Elvis gave it everything he had, the driving rhythm, the rising energy, the way he moved when the music took hold of him. He sang Blue Moon of Kentucky, the only way he knew how to sing it, fast, urgent, alive. His hips moved, his legs shook, his whole body became an instrument of the music, channeling something that came from a place deeper than technique or training. When the song ended, there was applause, polite applause, the kind of applause an audience gives when they are not sure what they have just witnessed and do not wish to be rude. It was not the explosive response Elvis had received at the small clubs across the South, where young people screamed and rushed the stage. It was the measured response of an establishment that did not know what to do with him. Backstage, Elvis encountered Bill Monroe himself, the man who had written Blue Moon of Kentucky, the father of bluegrass music, a legend who had every right to be offended by what this young upstart had done to his song. But Monroe surprised him. He told Elvis that he liked the performance. He told him that he had even recorded a new version of the song that followed Elvis's arrangement more closely. It was a moment of grace from an unexpected source. But Bill Monroe was not in charge of the Opry. Jim Denny was the talent manager of the Grand Ole Opry, the man who decided which performers would be invited back and which would never appear again. After Elvis's performance, Denny found him backstage. The hallway was crowded with other performers and stagehands and the general chaos of a live radio broadcast. Elvis stood alone, still catching his breath, hoping for some word of encouragement. Denny looked at him. For a moment, neither man spoke. What exactly Jim Denny said that night has been disputed over the decades. Some versions of the story have him using language too offensive to repeat, slurs against the music Elvis had performed, dismissals that cut not just at his talent, but at his very identity. Other accounts soften the words, suggesting Denny simply told Elvis that he was not a good fit for the Opry and should consider other career options. But Elvis himself told Scotty Moore what happened. And according to Elvis, Denny's message was clear. He should go back to Memphis and resume his job driving trucks. The words hit Elvis like a physical blow. This was not just a rejection of his performance. This was a rejection of everything he had dared to believe about himself. The idea that he was special, that he had something to offer, that the voice inside him meant something. His mother had told him since childhood that he was destined for greatness. Sam Phillips had taken a chance on him when no one else would. And now the most powerful man in country music was telling him to give up. Elvis did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply walked away, gathered Scotty and Bill, and headed for the car. The drive back to Memphis took 5 hours. Elvis spent most of it in the back seat, crying. Scotty and Bill tried to find words of comfort, but there were none adequate to the moment. They had witnessed something break in their young frontman. Not his spirit exactly, but something more fragile. His belief in the kindness of the world, perhaps.
His faith that talent and hard work would be enough. At a gas station somewhere in the Tennessee countryside, they pulled over. The night was cold and dark and silent. Elvis went inside to use the restroom, and when he returned, he was still wiping tears from his face. None of them noticed that he had left his suitcase behind. It contained his stage clothes, his personal items, the few material possessions that represented his nascent career. They would not realize it was missing until they reached Memphis. By then, it hardly seemed to matter. The suitcase could be replaced. The dream felt like it could not. What the gatekeepers of Nashville did not understand, what Jim Denny could not have known, was that rejection would become the fuel that powered Elvis Presley for the rest of his life. 2 weeks after the Opry disaster, Elvis appeared on the Louisiana Hayride, a competing radio show broadcast from Shreveport. Unlike the Opry, the Hayride had a reputation for taking chances on unconventional artists. It had given a platform to Hank Williams after Nashville rejected him. Now it would do the same for Elvis Presley. The response was electric. The audience at the Shreveport Municipal Auditorium screamed and cheered and rushed toward the stage. Young women reached for him. Young men studied his movements, trying to understand what made him different. Within weeks, Elvis had signed a contract to appear on the Hayride every Saturday night for a year, 52 performances that would give him the exposure and experience he needed to become something more than a regional curiosity. He never forgot what Jim Denny had said to him. He never forgot the polite applause of that Opry audience, the feeling of standing on the most famous stage in country music and being told he did not belong. He swore he would never go back, and he never did. Not as a performer, not in his entire life, even as he became the biggest star in the world, even as his records sold millions of copies, and his movies packed theaters, and his name became synonymous with American popular culture. Elvis Presley never returned to the Grand Ole Opry stage. He visited backstage occasionally. In 1957, at the height of his fame, he stopped by the Ryman to see friends, but he watched from the wings. He never stepped into the spotlight. The wound was too deep. There is a particular cruelty in telling a young person that their dreams are worthless. It is the cruelty of certainty, the assumption that the gatekeeper knows what success looks like, what talent sounds like, what the future will value. Jim Denny looked at Elvis Presley and saw a kid who did not fit the mold. He heard a sound that did not match what country music was supposed to be, and so he dismissed him, the way countless gatekeepers have dismissed countless dreamers throughout history. But Denny was wrong, not just wrong in hindsight, but wrong in principle. He could not see what Elvis Presley was, because it did not yet have a name. The music Elvis made was not country, or blues, or pop. It was rock and roll, a genre that barely existed in October 1954, a sound that was still being invented in small studios and roadside clubs across the American South. Elvis was not failing to meet the standards of the past. He was creating the standards of the future. Within 2 years, Elvis Presley would be the most famous entertainer in America. Within 5 years, he would be a cultural phenomenon that transcended music, a symbol of youth and rebellion, and the seismic changes transforming post-war society. The Ed Sullivan Show would refuse to show him from the waist down. Parents would ban his records from their homes. Ministers would denounce him from their pulpits. And through it all, teenagers would scream and cry and faint at the mere sight of him, feeling something they could not articulate but could not deny. The man who told Elvis to go back to driving trucks would live to see all of this. Jim Denny remained in the music business for years, eventually leaving the Opry to work as a manager and music publisher. He died in 1963, just as Elvis was completing his transition from rock and roll rebel to Hollywood movie star. Whether Denny ever regretted his words, whether he ever reconsidered his judgment, history does not record. But there is another part of this story that deserves attention, a quieter moment that reveals something essential about who Elvis Presley was beneath the legend. When Elvis finally got home to Memphis after that devastating night, he did not go to bed. He did not wallow in despair. He went to see his mother. Gladys Presley was the most important person in her son's life. She had raised him in poverty so deep they sometimes went hungry. She had believed in him when no one else did, telling him since childhood that he was special, that God had given him his gift for a reason. When his twin brother Jesse was stillborn, Gladys had poured all of her love and all of her fierce protective energy into the son who survived. Elvis, in turn, adored her with an intensity that some found unsettling. They called each other by baby names. They spoke in a private language. He was 19 years old and still lived at home, in a small house his truck driving wages could barely afford. That night, after the Opry, Elvis sat with his mother and told her what had happened. He told her about the polite applause and the dismissive words and the long, tear-filled drive home. And Gladys Presley looked at her son, her beautiful, broken, brilliant son, and said the words he needed to hear. She told him that one man's opinion did not determine his worth. She told him that the people who mattered, the young people in the clubs, the listeners who called the radio stations, the fans who already believed in him, knew the truth. She told him to keep going. She told him he was still special. She told him what mothers have told their children since the beginning of time, that she loved him, that she believed in him, and that tomorrow was another day. Elvis listened, and then he got up the next morning and went back to work. Less than a month after the Opry rejection, Elvis, Scotty, and Bill made a decision that would change their lives. They quit their day jobs. All three of them, Elvis the truck driver, Scotty the hatter's apprentice, Bill the tire company worker, walked away from the security of regular paychecks to pursue music full-time. It was a gamble of almost reckless proportions. They had one minor regional hit. They had been rejected by the most prestigious venue in their genre. They had no guarantee that anyone outside Memphis would ever care about their music, but they believed, or at least they believed enough to keep going, to play the next show, and the show after that, to drive the endless miles between small-town auditoriums and county fairs and roadhouse clubs where the crowds grew larger and more fervent with each passing week.
By the summer of 1955, Colonel Tom Parker had entered the picture. The carnival huckster turned talent manager who would guide Elvis's career to unimaginable heights and eventually contribute to its tragic decline. In November 1955, Sam Phillips sold Elvis's contract to RCA Victor for $35,000. At the time, the highest price ever paid for a recording artist. By January 1956, Elvis had recorded Heartbreak Hotel. By April, it was the #1 song in America. The rest is history. But history sometimes forgets the moments of doubt that precede triumph. It forgets the night drives and the lost suitcases and the tears shed in the back seats of cars traveling between rejection and redemption. It forgets that the king of rock and roll was once a frightened teenager standing backstage at the Grand Ole Opry, telling a stranger that the audience was going to hate him. Years later, when interviewers would ask Elvis about his early career, he rarely mentioned the Opry by name. He preferred to talk about the Louisiana hayride, about the small clubs where he learned his craft, about Sam Phillips and the magic that happened at Sun Studio. The Opry experience was a wound he kept private, a scar that never fully healed. But the scar was also a reminder. It was proof that rejection does not have to be the end of the story. It was evidence that the gatekeepers of any era can be wrong, that the future often sounds strange to ears trained to hear only the past. In 2024, 70 years after Elvis Presley's lone Opry appearance, the Ryman Auditorium opened a new exhibit commemorating that night. It features photographs, artifacts, and audio recordings from the era. It tells the story of a young man who bombed on the biggest stage in country music and went on to change the world. The exhibit presents the rejection, not as a failure, but as a turning point, the moment when Elvis Presley stopped trying to fit into someone else's mold and began creating a mold of his own. Today, visitors to the Ryman can stand where Elvis stood that October night. They can look out at the same pews, the same wooden walls, the same space where a nervous 19-year-old gave everything he had and received polite applause in return. Some of them are young people who have heard the word no from their own gatekeepers. Some of them are older, people who remember when Elvis was still alive, when his music was still new, when the sound he made seemed to threaten the very foundations of American society. All of them walk out of that building knowing something important, that the most famous rejection in music history was also the beginning of the most remarkable career in music history. The man who was told to go back to driving trucks became the king of rock and roll. The boy who cried in the back seat of a car sold more records than any solo artist in history. The performer who was not good enough for the Grand Ole Opry became too big for any stage to contain. Gladys Presley did not live to see her son at the height of his fame. She died in August 1958, just as Elvis was preparing to leave for army service in Germany. He was 23 years old. She was 46. The grief nearly destroyed him. Some who knew him say he never fully recovered, that something essential went out of him when his mother died, leaving a void that fame and money and adoration could never fill. But in October 1954, she was still alive. She was still there to hold him when the world told him he was worthless. She was still there to remind him that he was her special boy, her prince, the son who had survived when his twin brother did not. And maybe that is the real story of the night Elvis Presley was rejected by the Grand Ole Opry. Not the cruelty of Jim Denny, or the polite applause of the audience, or the long drive home through the Tennessee darkness. The real story is what happened afterward. The mother who believed when no one else did, the son who kept going when every rational voice told him to quit, the stubborn human refusal to let one night define an entire life. The suitcase Elvis left behind at that gas station was eventually recovered. Someone found it hanging on the back of the bathroom door, recognized the name on the luggage tag, and mailed it back to Memphis. The stage clothes inside were wrinkled but intact.
The possessions were all accounted for. Elvis would go on to own houses and cars and jewels and everything that money could buy. He would live in a mansion called Graceland, surrounded by friends and family, and an entourage that catered to his every need. But he never forgot what it felt like to have nothing, to be a truck driver's son from Tupelo, Mississippi, standing on a stage in Nashville, hoping that someone would believe in him. Every dreamer, at some point, faces their own Grand Ole Opry moment, the audition that goes badly, the rejection letter that arrives, the authority figure who says the words that cut deepest, "You're not good enough. Go back to your day job. Give up." Most of us will never become Elvis Presley. Most of us will never prove the gatekeepers wrong on such a spectacular scale. But the question remains, haunting and essential, as relevant today as it was on that October night in 1954. When someone tells you to give up on your dream, do you listen, or do you get up the next morning and keep going?